Hey everyone, we are back this time with a lecture about World War II. So we're going to continue talking about what's happening at home in the United States during World War II, and then we're going to talk about some of the significant battles that the United States and other allies are involved in stopping the Germans. So we're going to be still on the European front in this. So let's get started. We're going to start with the war effort at home. And this slide says that it's expanding. And we say that because factories are really increasing production of wartime products. And because of that, a lot of people are going to be migrating into towns and really get those towns, cities, get them booming again. Some of those boom towns are Los Angeles, Detroit, Seattle, and Baton Rouge, um, which is not really one that you would think of. But southern cities are definitely helped in significant ways by war industries. So all these migrants are coming in looking for work, and a lot of them are going into the South because FDR is giving a lot of resources to the South, a lot of defense contracts to Southern factories because he knows that the South is really, really hurting. And so you would think that African Americans would stay since there are a lot more jobs in the South. Instead, what happens is about 1.6 million blacks continue to leave the South. And this is something that we've talked about before when we talked about the Great Migration in the right after World War One and into the 20s, and this is going to happen again during World War Two. And so, in the decade of between 1940 and 1950, millions of blacks are going to move north into the cities of the north looking for jobs. They're also going to move west to cities like Los Angeles. We're going to talk about what's going to happen in Los Angeles in a minute. So, because of all this black migration, race relations are going to become a national problem because FDR really needs black support, A, because they're voting for him, B, he also needs them working to support the war effort. So, he is going to respond by issuing an executive order that forbade discrimination in defense industries. So, you can't depend on race to decide whether or not you're going to hire somebody for a defense industry. So if you have a defense contract, you've got to be colorblind basically in your hiring. He also formed the Fair Employment Practices Commission to make sure that there was no discrimination taking place in defense industries. This movement towards ending segregation and discrimination in the armed forces is going to continue even after World War II. We're going to see Truman integrate troops. Okay? In general, the war is going to help blacks. As I just said, they're going to continue getting more rights because of these moves dealing with defense. In addition, membership in the NAACP is going to go way up. There's going to be a new organization is going to form. It promoted nonviolent direct action. It's formed in 1942. We're going to see it again being important. We talk about the civil rights movement. It's called CORE, C-O-R-E, and CORE stands for the Congress of Racial Equality. Um, so in addition to blacks, we're going to see lots of American Indian migrations. Thousands of American Indians are going to leave their reservations. And they're going to be looking for work in cities and also in the military. And one of the most famous military groups of American Indians are the Navajo Code Talkers. Um, they were able to, because of their knowledge of the Navajo language, develop an almost unbreakable code that the Allies were able to use to help them defeat the Germans. You may have seen recently President Trump had them at the White House to honor their efforts during World War II. Let's talk about Mexican Americans. We talked about a lot of Mexicans coming into the U.S. to work in agricultural jobs as people are going to war and people are going into factories. Um, immigrants are coming in from Mexico to work in agricultural jobs and in other jobs. And so what ends up happening is that you have larger numbers of minorities in cities, and that causes race issues to kind of come to the forefront, and there's going to be some rioting and some issues with violence because of race relations. In 1943, the zoot suit was fashionable. This picture that popped up when I advanced the slide is of a man wearing a zoot suit. It's a very high-waisted pair of pants with very billowy legs that kind of taper down and get smaller at the bottom. We'll look at some other pictures and talk some more about the zoot suit riots in class, but basically what happens is that these Mexican Americans, there were some African Americans involved as well. They are attacked by Navy sailors who are in LA and who see them as causing trouble. And so basically, these sailors just go around with clubs and other weapons and start beating up anybody who's wearing a zoot suit. This basically helps the Germans because it promotes an image that America is divided, that we can't agree in terms of the war. Eventually, the Zoot Suit riots in LA are stopped, but it does spread into other cities. So it's not a great time in terms of race relations in that case. So let's turn now to all right, so we're going to talk now about how the U.S. and our allies start making advances on the Germans in Europe. We'll turn to the Pacific later, but in Europe, we're really going to start having some success against Germany and eventually leading to Hitler's surrender. It's going to take a few years, though. Start with talking about the Enigma Code. So the Germans were using their U-boats to really disrupt shipping in the Atlantic Ocean, and the British, led by Alan Turing and his team, were able to finally crack the Enigma Code, the German code that was preventing us from knowing what the Germans were doing. By cracking that code, we were able to see the position of German U-boats and know how to attack them or when to attack them, and also know how to get our ships around them. So that became a huge advantage when that happened. In addition, Germany is going to be stopped in Stalingrad in September of 1942. It's going to be what many people consider the most impressive battle of the war. About 2 million people died in the war or in this battle, however, so it was very deadly. It does, however, stop the Germans from making any significant progress into the Soviet Union. They're not going to try to invade the Soviet Union again after Stalingrad. By the end of the war, over 20 million Soviets had died, so the Soviet Union really loses a lot of soldiers in this fighting. Stalin begs the Allies to open a second front in Europe so that he's not just having to fight the Germans alone, to relieve some of the pressure on him. And fearing that they weren't quite ready to go into France, the US and Britain chose to attack the Germans in North Africa. They had had some success before when General Erwin Rommel had been stopped just short of the Suez Canal, but now they're going to really go into an all-out assault on North Africa. This is going to be difficult fighting. Soldiers are going to have to deal with extreme temperatures. They're going to have to wear sand goggles because sand is inflaming their eyes, getting in all their stuff. There were times when the wind would blow so hard that there would be zero visibility. In addition, they're in the desert. And it's pretty flat, and so it's difficult to camouflage yourself and conceal where you are. The blinding sun makes it difficult to see what's happening in the sky. The Germans would sometimes wait until noon when the sun was at full bore to attack because the Allies wouldn't be able to see them as easily. However, under the lead of General George Patton, the Americans were able to trap the Germans and their Italian allies in Tunisia. This ends the North Africa campaign in May of 1943. We capture many German and Italian prisoners of war. The number of prisoners of war taken in North Africa is a lot higher than in a lot of other battles, in part because the prisoners of war just surrender and want to be arrested because there's nowhere to go in North Africa. You can't really hide in the desert, and if you try, you don't have any food or water, and there's no way to get those supplies. So there were a lot of POWs because of that. After winning in North Africa, the Allies cross the Mediterranean and land on Sicily, just outside or just off the coast of the Italian mainland, and they start pushing into Italy. Sicily is going to fall in August of 1943. Mussolini is going to be overthrown. Italy is going to surrender in the war, but the Germans stay there. And it's not going to end in Italy until June of 1944 when the Allies are able to take Rome. From November 28th to December 1st of 1943, so while fighting in Italy is going on, FDR, Churchill, and Stalin are all going to meet in Tehran, in Iran, and this is a picture of them meeting. And the goal is to come up with a broad plan so that they can align what the Soviets are doing and how they're attacking the Germans in the East with what the other Allied forces are doing to attack the Germans in the West, in the hopes that if they can come to some agreement and some broad arrangement, they can overcome or they can overpower the Germans and force them to surrender. The Allied forces are going to prepare an invasion into France from Great Britain. 3 million troops are going to prepare for this invasion. They're going to train in Great Britain. Command of the invasion is given to Dwight Eisenhower. They're on June 6th, 1944. 4,600 vessels are going to carry men across the English Channel into France. They're going to fight to secure a beachhead, a place to land, or a place to beach their ships. Allied troops are going to push inland. After they disembark, we're going to watch the beginning of Saving Private Ryan to see what that disembarking was like, and we're also going to read some accounts and look at some pictures and do some other things with D-Day, so I'm not going to talk a ton about it, but after they land, they're going to continue pushing inland into France, going across France. Mainly they're going to be led by General George Patton. And by August 1944, they're going to have liberated Paris. So it takes about 2 months to get all the way to Paris and liberate it from the Nazis. The Germans are then going to make one last push to capture the port city of Antwerp. An all-out assault is launched in the American lines at the Ardennes Forest, and this is known as the Battle of the Bulge. The German advance ends up being stopped because they run out of fuel to continue the assault. And we'll talk more about the Battle of the Bulge later as well. In the middle of all this, FDR faces re-election again. Remember, he's in his 3rd term. He's now going to run once again. The Republicans are going to nominate the governor of New York, Thomas Dewey. It was a given that FDR was going to be the Democratic nominee. The real question was who was going to be his vice president. People didn't like his previous vice president, Henry Wallace, because people considered him too liberal. So FDR compromised and agrees to choose Harry Truman. He was a senator from Missouri. He seemed more moderate, and so that's who FDR chose. Once again, he wins an easy electoral college victory. This time he wins 432 electoral votes to 99 for Dewey. FDR won primarily because the war's going well and people want to continue with his leadership. They think that he's experienced and they're going to need that experienced hand to help figure out what the world is going to look like once the war is finally over. As Americans go into Europe, they're going to discover concentration camps. We'll talk more about the Holocaust. We've already talked a little bit about it. We'll talk more about it after we talk about D-Day. But what's going to end up happening is that 6 million Jews are going to be killed. 12 million total people are killed in the Holocaust by the end of World War II. It's not just Jews who are put in concentration camps. Hitler basically puts in anybody who disagrees with him, anybody who's trying to aid Jews in escaping are put in concentration camps. As Americans start closing in on Germany and pushing towards the end of the war, FDR dies. He has a cerebral hemorrhage, a hemorrhage in his brain, and he dies on April 12th, 1945, not long after he was inaugurated for his 4th term as president. So Truman is going to become president. And we'll talk about what that looks like when we talk about the war in the Pacific. The Soviet Union is going to reach Berlin in April of 1945. Hitler is going to commit suicide on April 30th, 1945, and Germany's going to surrender on May 7th, 1945. This is called VE Day, or VE Day is proclaimed the next day, May 8th, which means Victory in Europe Day. So this kind of explains what happens in Europe on the European front in the war. We'll talk, not next class, but probably the class after that, about what happens in the Pacific with that front of the war. So make sure you've taken notes. If you need to go back and listen to anything, do that. And I will see you in class tomorrow, where we'll start with a quiz and then we'll talk more about D-Day. Have a good one.